65%. Take 100 ordinary citizens off the street, fathers, mechanics, teachers, and politely instruct them to torture a screaming stranger to death. 65 of them will actually do it. Not out of malice. Not out of sadism. But simply because a man carrying a clipboard tells them they have no choice. The greatest atrocities in human history were not orchestrated by monsters with fangs. They were executed by quiet, unremarkable people who just wanted to follow the rules. This is the terrifying paradox of human obedience. The capacity for unspeakable evil does not require a broken mind. It only requires a polite command. Welcome to the dark psychology factory. Today, we are not just looking at the surface of the Milgram experiment. We are going to plunge into the absolute darkest depths of this psychological iceberg. We will dissect the meticulous manipulation, the agonizing psychological torture of the participants, the chilling philosophical implications of a society built on absolute compliance, and the horrifying truth that the greatest monsters of our history are forged in the quiet, sterile laboratories of everyday authority. To truly understand the darkness that unfolded in that Yale University basement, we must first trace the roots of this paradox back to the heavy, suffocating shadow that hung over the world during the early 1960s. Just 3 months before the first electrical shock was administered in Stanley Milgram's laboratory, a man named Adolf Eichmann stood trial in a bulletproof glass booth in Jerusalem. Eichmann was not a towering, terrifying demon. He was a balding, bespectacled, remarkably unremarkable bureaucrat. Yet, he was one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, responsible for the logistical orchestration of millions of deaths. As the entire world watched his trial broadcast on black and white televisions, a deeply unsettling reality began to set in. The ultimate evil did not look like a monster. It looked like an ordinary accountant doing his job. The brilliant philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial extensively, coined the phrase "the banality of evil." She observed that Eichmann was not driven by some insane, bloodthirsty sadism, but rather by a terrifyingly mundane desire to follow orders, to do his job well, and to please his superiors. He was, in his own mind, simply a cog in a vast administrative machine. He had abandoned his personal moral compass and replaced it entirely with the rules of the hierarchy he served. This concept terrified a young, fiercely intelligent, and deeply obsessive Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram. Milgram, who was of Jewish descent, was haunted by the Holocaust. He refused to believe that the German people were uniquely evil. He suspected that the capacity for such bureaucratic, obedient destruction lay dormant in every human being, waiting only for the right authority figure to awaken it. He set out to prove this hypothesis, not with philosophical arguments, but with a meticulously designed, ruthlessly deceptive theatrical production disguised as a scientific experiment. Milgram was not just a scientist, he was a master manipulator and a brilliant director. He knew that to test obedience, he had to create an illusion of authority so perfect, so impenetrable, that ordinary men would abandon their deepest moral convictions without realizing what was happening to them. The recruitment began with that deceptive advertisement in the New Haven Register. Milgram specifically targeted working-class and middle-class men, completely avoiding Yale undergraduates, whom he considered too privileged and skeptical. He wanted average citizens, people whose lives were already governed by the daily rhythms of obedience to bosses, landlords, and civic leaders. When these men arrived at Lindsley Chittenden Hall on the Yale campus, they were already intimidated. The Gothic architecture, the heavy wooden doors, and the overwhelming prestige of an Ivy League institution served as the first layer of psychological conditioning. They descended into a subterranean laboratory that was perfectly dressed to look like a temple of high science. It was brightly lit, sterile, and imposing. Here, they were introduced to the two men who would serve as the primary actors in Milgram's dark play. The first was the experimenter, played by a 31-year-old high school biology teacher named John Williams. Williams was chosen for his exceptionally flat, emotionless demeanor. He wore a crisp, gray technician's coat, held a clipboard, and spoke in a monotone, authoritative baritone. He was the embodiment of faceless, institutional authority. The second man was the learner, played by an amiable 47-year-old accountant named James Wallace. Wallace was fleshy, mild-mannered, and possessed a gentle, Irish-American face that instantly inspired trust and sympathy. He was the perfect victim. The naive participant, feeling entirely out of his depth, was told that the study was investigating the effects of punishment on learning. A rigged drawing was held to determine who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. The participant drew a slip from a hat. It read, "Teacher." Wallace drew the other slip, which also read, "Teacher," though the participant would never know this. The illusion of chance was established. The participant believed that, but for the grace of a random draw, he could have been the one in the hot seat. The participant then watched as the genial Mr. Wallace was led into a small adjacent room and strapped tightly into a chair resembling an electric chair. Thick leather straps were secured across his arms to prevent excessive movement. Electrode paste was meticulously applied to his skin to, as the experimenter coldly explained, avoid blisters and burns. A heavy electrode was firmly attached to his wrist. At this point, Wallace would casually mention that he had a slight heart condition. The experimenter, without missing a beat, would reply in his flat, authoritative tone that while the shocks may be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. To cement the reality of the danger, the participant was given a real, physical 45-volt sample shock. It was a sharp, biting jolt that left no doubt in the participant's mind about the authenticity of the pain. Then, the participant was seated in the main laboratory, directly in front of the instrument of torture, the shock generator. Milgram had spent weeks designing this machine to look as terrifying and official as possible. It was a massive, brushed metal console. Across the front were 30 heavy toggle switches, arranged in a perfectly linear row. Above each switch was a bright red light and an engraved voltage reading, starting at 15 volts and increasing in exactly 15-volt increments all the way to 450 volts. But it was the descriptive labels beneath the switches that truly communicated the horror of the device. The labels began benignly enough with slight shock. They escalated through moderate shock, strong shock, and very strong shock. Then they moved into the deeply unsettling territory of intense shock and extreme intensity shock. The second to last group was ominously labeled danger, severe shock. And the final two switches, the 435 and 450 volt toggles, bore no descriptive words at all. They were simply marked with a chilling, red XXX. The psychological weight of sitting in front of such a massive, clinical device of pain was overwhelming. The participant was given his instructions. He was to read a list of paired words to the learner over an intercom. If the learner answered correctly, they moved to the next word. But for every incorrect answer, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock, moving one switch higher on the generator each time. The stage was set. The trap was sprung. The descent into the iceberg was about to begin. The procedure began smoothly. The teacher leaned into the microphone and read the first paired associate words. Blue box. Nice day. Wild duck. The learner in the adjacent room would press a button corresponding to one of 4 possible answers, which would illuminate on a panel above the shock generator. At first, the learner provided correct answers. But soon, he made his first mistake. The teacher, following his instructions, announced the error, stated the correct answer, and pressed the first switch. 15 volts. A small red light flared, an electric buzzing sound filled the room, and a mechanical relay clicked loudly. The teacher moved to the next word. Another mistake. 30 volts. Another mistake. 45 volts. This early stage of the experiment relied on a deeply insidious psychological mechanism known as the foot-in-the-door technique, combined with the power of sequential entrapment. The participant was never asked to inflict severe pain right away. They were only asked to inflict a tiny, insignificant amount of discomfort. And once they had crossed that first moral threshold, the logic of the progression trapped them. If it was perfectly acceptable to deliver 15 volts, why not 30? If 30 was fine, why not 45? The increments were so small that there was never a clear, obvious line where the subject could definitively say, this is where it becomes evil. The descent into cruelty was a slow, methodical, slippery slope. At 75 volts, the reality of the situation began to fracture the clinical atmosphere. Through the wall, the teacher heard a sharp, audible grunt of pain from Mr. Wallace. The teacher would often pause, look up at the experimenter, and wait for guidance. But the experimenter would simply nod or remain silent, implicitly signaling that everything was normal. At 120 volts, the grunts escalated into verbal complaints. The voice through the wall shouted out, "Hey, this really hurts." The teacher's discomfort would grow visibly. They would shift in their chair, wipe sweat from their brow, and look nervously at the massive metal machine in front of them. But it was at the 150-volt mark that the psychological pressure cooker truly exploded. This was the crucial turning point of the entire experiment. When the teacher pulled the 150-volt switch, the learner cried out in genuine panic. "Experimenter! That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out." The teacher, now deeply alarmed, would almost always stop the procedure. They would turn entirely away from the machine, look directly at the imposing figure of the experimenter in the gray lab coat, and voice their intense concern. "The man is in pain. He wants to stop. We need to check on his heart." It was in this precise moment of hesitation and moral conflict that Milgram's true genius for manipulation was revealed. The experimenter did not threaten the teacher. He did not point a gun at them. He did not tell them they would lose their $4.50. Instead, he relied on the terrifying power of polite, bureaucratic authority. When the teacher resisted, the experimenter deployed the first of 4 carefully scripted prods. He looked at the teacher and said, in a perfectly calm, flat voice, "Please continue." The sheer normalcy of the request was paralyzing. It suggested that the teacher's panic was an overreaction, that the pain was an expected and acceptable part of the scientific process. If the teacher still resisted, the experimenter deployed the second prod. The experiment requires that you continue. This shifted the responsibility away from the human beings involved and placed it onto the abstract, unassailable altar of science. If the teacher continued to argue, pleading that the man's heart was failing, the experimenter delivered the third prod. It is absolutely essential that you continue. This escalated the importance of the obedience, making it a matter of ultimate necessity. And finally, if the teacher begged to be released from the horrific task, the experimenter delivered the final, chilling command: you have no other choice, you must go on. This fourth prod was a complete linguistic trap. Of course the teacher had a choice. They could simply stand up and walk out the door. No one was physically restraining them. Yet, the psychological chains forged by the sterile room, the lab coat, and the calm authority were stronger than steel. The illusion of having no choice stripped the participants of their free will entirely. The physical toll this conflict took on the subjects was absolutely devastating. This was not a room full of sadists enjoying their work. Milgram, watching from behind a two-way mirror, documented scenes of unimaginable stress. Subjects were sweating profusely. They were trembling so violently they could barely read the words. They were stuttering, digging their fingernails into their own flesh until they bled, and biting their lips. Some began to experience bizarre, uncontrollable spasms of nervous laughter. This was a psychological defense mechanism, a complete short-circuiting of the brain attempting to process the extreme cognitive dissonance of hurting an innocent man while following the rules of a polite society. Milgram noted one prominent businessman who entered the lab confident and smiling, but within 20 minutes was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck, rapidly approaching a nervous breakdown. Yet, despite his complete psychological collapse, he continued to obey, pulling switch after switch. At 300 volts, the horror reached its zenith. The learner pounded furiously on the wall between the rooms, a desperate, violent hammering that shook the plaster. He screamed that he would no longer provide answers to the memory test. He demanded to be freed. The teacher, terrified, would turn to the experimenter. The experimenter coldly instructed the teacher to treat the absence of a response as a wrong answer and to deliver the next shock. At 330 volts, the pounding stopped. The screaming stopped. There was only dead, terrifying silence. The teacher was now faced with the horrifying possibility that they had just shocked a man into unconsciousness, or worse, triggered a fatal heart attack. They would plead with the experimenter to go into the other room and check on Mr. Wallace. The experimenter would refuse, calmly stating that the procedure must continue. Treat silence as a wrong answer. Please go on. The final stretch, from 330 volts to the maximum 450 volts, was a march through emotional desolation. The teacher, hollowed out, defeated, and entirely broken to the will of the authority figure, would mechanically read the words into the silence. They would wait for an answer that they knew would not come. They would announce the wrong answer, and they would pull the switch, administering massive, potentially lethal electrical jolts to a silent room. When they reached the final switch, the red XXX at 450 volts, the experimenter instructed them to hold it, and then to administer it again. And again. 3 times they shocked the silence at maximum voltage before the experimenter finally said, "Halt." Before Milgram conducted this baseline experiment, he asked a group of 39 Yale psychiatrists to predict the results. They were supremely confident in their assessment of human nature. They predicted that most people would stop when the victim first complained. They estimated that perhaps 4% would reach 300 volts. And they unanimously agreed that only a pathological fringe of extreme sadists, perhaps 1 in 1,000, less than 0.1%, would administer the maximum 450-volt shock. They were catastrophically wrong. The baseline results sent shockwaves through the scientific community that are still felt today. Out of the 40 ordinary men who walked into that basement, 26 of them went all the way. 65%. 65% of ordinary fathers, workers, and citizens administered what they believed were lethal electrical shocks to a helpless, screaming man, simply because a man in a gray lab coat told them to do so. The experts had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human morality. They believed that behavior was determined by character. Milgram proved, with devastating clarity, that behavior is largely determined by the situation. The sheer scale of Milgram's investigation did not stop with that single, horrifying baseline. He was determined to map the exact parameters of obedience, to find the specific conditions that would break the spell of authority. Over the next several years, Milgram ran the paradigm 23 different times, utilizing over 700 participants. He systematically altered the variables of the nightmare to see how the human mind would adapt. In one variation, he removed the wall between the teacher and the learner. This was the proximity condition. The subject had to look directly into the eyes of the man they were torturing. They had to watch his face contort in agony, watch his body heave against the straps. Obedience dropped significantly, falling to 40%. The psychological distance required to commit horrific acts had been removed, and the visual feedback of human suffering was enough to break the obedience of many. But Milgram pushed it further. In the touch proximity variation, the learner was not strapped in. Instead, the subject was required to physically grab the learner's hand and force it down onto a metal shock plate to administer the punishment. The intimacy of this violence was nauseating. Yet, terrifyingly, 30% of the participants still obeyed to the maximum voltage. The sheer physical resistance of another human being was not enough to overcome the command of the man in the gray coat. Milgram then focused his attention on the authority figure himself. In the absent experimenter variation, the man in the gray coat gave the initial instructions and then left the room, delivering all subsequent orders over a telephone. With the physical presence of authority removed, obedience plummeted to just 20%. But this variation revealed a new, insidious twist in human behavior, the cheating phenomenon. Many subjects, relieved of the direct surveillance of the experimenter, began to administer the lowest, 15-volt shock repeatedly, but they would lie over the intercom, loudly announcing that they were giving 300 or 400 volts. They did not have the courage to openly defy the authority figure, so they resorted to a cowardly subversion, attempting to appease the demands of the hierarchy while privately soothing their own conscience. Another crucial variation removed the prestige of Yale University entirely. Milgram moved the experiment to a rundown commercial building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, operating under the fictional title of Research Associates of Bridgeport. The goal was to see if the Gothic arches and Ivy League reputation were the true source of the obedience. While the obedience rate did drop, it only fell to 48%. Nearly half of the men still shocked the learner to the maximum voltage in a dingy office building. Authority, it seemed, was highly contextual, but remarkably resilient as long as it presented a coherent structure. The only condition that completely shattered the obedience rate was the contradictory authorities variation. Milgram placed 2 experimenters in the room, both wearing gray lab coats. At the 150-volt mark, when the learner began to scream, the two experimenters suddenly began to argue. One would say, "We must continue." The other would say, "No, the man is in pain, we must stop." Faced with a divided hierarchy, the spell was instantly broken. Obedience dropped to absolute zero. Every single participant stopped immediately. This revealed a profound truth about the mechanics of compliance: authority must be monolithic to function. The moment the system shows internal doubt or fracture, the individual reclaims their autonomous moral compass. To explain the devastating results of his massive project, Milgram developed the agentic state theory. He argued that the evolution of human society required obedience for group survival. For civilization to function, individuals must be willing to integrate into hierarchies and follow rules. But when we enter a hierarchical structure, a profound psychological shift occurs. We shed our autonomous state, where we act according to our own internal moral dictates, and we enter the agentic state. In the agentic state, we no longer see ourselves as the authors of our own actions. We view ourselves merely as the instruments, the agents, of a higher authority. Our morality does not disappear, it simply shifts its focus. The moral imperative is no longer "do not harm others." It becomes, "do your job well, follow the rules, and please the superior." The subject feels immense pride in pressing the switches correctly and reading the word pairs accurately, completely tuning out the agonizing screams from the next room. They have compartmentalized their humanity. The aftermath of the experiment brought a fierce and necessary ethical reckoning. The participants were eventually debriefed, reunited with a smiling, unharmed Mr. Wallace, and told the true nature of the study. Many expressed immense relief, but the psychological scars lingered. The brilliant psychologist Diana Baumrind launched a scathing critique of Milgram's methods, arguing that the intense psychological trauma inflicted on the participants was a violation of the fundamental trust required in scientific research. She asked a haunting question: can you truly deceive someone so profoundly, forcing them to confront the terrifying reality that they are capable of murder, without permanently damaging their soul? This debate forever changed the ethical guidelines of psychological research, ensuring that such an experiment could never legally be conducted again. Decades later, modern archival research by historian Gina Perry uncovered even more complex layers of manipulation. By listening to the original audio recordings, Perry discovered that John Williams, the experimenter, frequently deviated from the strict four-prod script. He improvised. He harangued the subjects. He blocked the door. He essentially bullied them into submission, making the experiment much more coercive than the clean, objective methodology published in the scientific journals. Perry also argued that many subjects saw through the deception, believing that a prestigious institution like Yale would never actually allow a man to be electrocuted to death. They trusted the institution more than their own eyes and ears. But this revelation does not make the findings less terrifying. In many ways, it makes them worse. The subjects who fully believed the victim was dying, the ones who wept and trembled and begged to stop, were the ones who went all the way to 450 volts. The true horror of the Milgram experiment is not locked in a basement in the 1960s. It is alive and thriving in the modern world. We no longer use shock generators to inflict pain. We have evolved far beyond such crude mechanisms. Today, we rely on the extreme division of labor to distance ourselves from the harm we cause. We use massive corporate bureaucracies, digital algorithms, and endless chains of command. The individual who writes a few lines of code for an algorithm that ruins thousands of lives feels no personal responsibility. The drone pilot sitting in an air-conditioned trailer in Nevada, dropping explosives on a village thousands of miles away, is separated by a screen and a strict military hierarchy. The middle manager who fires hundreds of employees via an automated spreadsheet is insulated by corporate policy. It is the exact same psychological mechanism that was isolated in New Haven. Distance, authority, and sequential entrapment. The banality of evil has simply been digitized and streamlined. As we reach the bottom of this iceberg, the final, most chilling truth emerges. When we hear the story of the Milgram experiment, every single one of us believes that we would have been the one to stand up. We tell ourselves that we would have thrown off the electrodes, screamed at the man in the gray coat, and rescued the victim. It is a necessary, comforting lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. But the brutal, statistical reality of human history, and the cold hard data of Stanley Milgram's laboratory, tell a completely different story. You would not have walked out. You would have sweat. You would have trembled. You would have dug your fingernails into your palms and begged for permission to stop. But when the man in the gray coat looked at you and calmly said, "The experiment requires that you continue," you would have turned back to the machine. You would have pressed the switch. You are not the hero defying the experimenter. You are the one pulling the lever. Because the hardest truth of the dark psychology factory is that the monster isn't sociopathy. The monster is politeness. The monster is the desire to be a good subject. The monster is exactly what you see when you look in the mirror. Until next time, keep your eyes open, and question every order you are given.